Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, a show on India's national television channel Doordarshan about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations, and India's involvement in shaping global institutions for planetary good. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking up India's role and leadership in multilateral climate negotiations. How India has performed in climate talks over the years, what are the major pressing issues from India's point of view and from that of the global south, and how are climate negotiations progressing and do they hold out hope for humanity? This is the theme for this episode. And to discuss this, let me introduce you to a very knowledgeable scholar on this field, Dr. Navroz Dubash. Dr. Dubash is one of India's leading thinkers on climate policies and governance. He is senior fellow at the Sustainable Futures Collaborative. Dr. Dubash, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you very much. It's very good to be part of this show on this important topic.
Dr. Dubash, climate is an existential crisis, and everybody acknowledges that this is, probably right up there in terms of the biggest problems that all of us face. And to meet this mega challenge, we have this phenomenon called climate diplomacy, annual summits. Climate Action Summit is happening in Dubai this year, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi is attending it. There is always an air of expectation about multilateral talks, but on the other hand, you have written that there is a torrent of words around these events, but it doesn't necessarily translate into action. And environmental activists and thinkers usually are disappointed with the outcomes of these events. So let me ask you to start with these Conference of Parties, COP, which keeps on happening annually. What is the benefit of these? And really, are they just talking shops, or do you think we still need these, because without these probably we will not even make minimal progress?
I think it's a very good place to start. Let's just pause by talking about the nature of this problem. The nature of this problem is such that we have to transform economies with an eye to the long term, with an eye to changing actually how economies develop in their relationship with fossil fuel. And we have to do this in a context where governments face 4 to 5 year cycles for elections. So it's a long-term problem with short-term politics. The COP is meant to bridge this, but there's a limit ultimately to the extent to which COPs can change national interests. These are going to be driven by national interests. So the COPs used to be thought of as places where top-down agreement was made on targets. This country will do this much, this country will do that much. That proved to be a very hard thing to agree on. And over 25 years of trying, eventually the COPs have shifted at the Paris Agreement moment to what is more of a bottom-up construction. The bottom-up construction is, you tell us what you're going to do in your country, what you think you can do. We will add it up and see if it's good enough. If it's not good enough, everybody go home and please try harder. This COP in Dubai is a moment where that adding up is happening for the first time. It's called the global stocktake, which is why it's significant. In some sense, it's a test of the model of the COP. So COPs are essential because they push governments. COPs are by no means sufficient because ultimately these are driven by national interest.
Yeah. And so a compromise will obviously come in when you have 198 member states and entities joining these negotiations. This year's COP28, they are saying 70,000 attendees are going to be there. Huge, mega, gatherings like these will obviously involve, give and take. And that's, of course, the essence of this climate diplomacy. So you've been observing, writing, and thinking about this for a long time. Do you think the outcomes that come as a result of this churning are sufficient, or obviously much more needs to be done? But it's a question of half empty or half full, right? Looking at the glass. So I suppose, if you imagine there was no COP process, no UN framework on climate change, then probably we would be in an even worse position, right? So, and that's the whole idea of global governance. So to that extent, I think we do need these summits.
No, absolutely. We do need these summits for two reasons. One reason is that governments have to be forced to pay attention to climate change when there are so many other pressing things. So the COP puts in place things like nationally determined contributions, long-term strategies. And I have been part of some of these conversations within the government of India, and the forcing effect of bringing people together to talk about things within the government is accomplished by the COP. It's a high stakes issue. So we have to put our best foot forward. It mobilizes the bureaucracy. That's one reason. Second reason is it is a global collective action problem at the end of the day. And there are some countries who had more of a role in causing it, the richer countries, and some countries that are going to be more suffering the consequences, the poorer countries. Now, there has to be some mechanism of compensation. This COP has agreed on a loss and damage fund, which is a great test of the value of these COPs. At the same time, expecting the COPs to override national interests, so getting countries to commit to very rapid phase down because of a global existential problem is unlikely. Ambassador Dasgupta, who was a doyen of Indian climate politics and negotiations, used to always say the first rule of COPs is that they cannot fail, because some text is always found that massages these different interests. But I have been writing increasingly that when it comes to the emissions reduction side, as I said, on the vulnerability side, on the collective action side, on the finance side, it's the COPs play a very big role. But on the mitigation side, that is the emissions reduction side, countries increasingly, what I'm finding, are moving when their interests align with a low carbon future. So we've seen in the case of India, we now increasingly feel that solar power and a hydrogen economy is in our own interest as well as a global interest.
It's
China
not because
has
of
moved on-
pressure. It's not because
That's
of
right.
pressure from outside. Yeah.
And no amount of pressure can make a country act against its national interest. So the question is, how do you come to that realization within a country? In China, air pollution drove it. The US, even though it's quite flawed, has come up with this Inflation Reduction Act where they are putting $360 billion behind clean energy technologies because they've decided that's their future route to competitiveness. So the trick lies in the international process nudging, the politics shifting within countries as we change our own interests, but the support through finance and the backstop for vulnerable people, again, coming from the international process. So you need
Yeah.
these both. It's a jugalbandi of sorts.
Right. So national interest, viewers, is at stake, and every country comes in with its best possible negotiating strategy, and so does India. And the amalgamation of all these national interests is what we get through the COP processes. Viewers, I have a very interesting historical look down the memory lane of COP and other environmental summits starting from the 1990s under the UN framework. What have they achieved? What are the significant milestones as we look up to COP28? Let's watch this video and continue the discussion.
In 1990, at the UN's Second World Climate Conference, scientists highlight the risks of global warming to nature and society. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher calls for binding emissions targets.
We need to speed up action and set ourselves higher targets and shorter deadlines.
In 1992, countries at the Rio Earth Summit sign on to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It establishes the idea that developed countries must do more to tackle climate warming emissions. In 1995, the first Conference of the Parties, or COP, is held in Berlin. A final document calls for legally binding emissions targets. In 1997, at COP3 in Kyoto, Japan, parties agree to emissions cuts for developed countries. In 2005, the Kyoto Protocol goes into effect. It's a legally binding treaty in which 55 countries agree to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In 2009, COP15 talks in Copenhagen nearly collapse amid efforts to agree to a binding post-Kyoto framework. Countries instead vote to take note of a non-binding political statement. COP 16, 17, and 18 all failed to set new binding emissions targets. Delegates in Doha at COP 18 instead extended the Kyoto Protocol through 2020. In 2015, COP 21 results in the Paris Agreement.
L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
The first global pact to call for increasingly ambitious emissions pledges from both developed and developing countries. Delegates also pledged to try to keep warming to within 1.5 degrees Celsius. In 2017, U.S. President Donald Trump pulls the U.S. out of the Paris Treaty.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris climate accord.
4 years later, in 2021, newly elected U.S. President Joe Biden rejoins the Paris Agreement. At COP26 later that year, the Glasgow Pact sets a goal of using less coal and resolves rules for trading carbon credits to offset emissions. In 2022, COP27 in Egypt marks a historic deal for a loss and damage fund for costly climate disasters, but does little to address the emissions fueling such disasters.
So viewers, you got a glimpse of the COP, Conference of Parties process over time. Dr. Dubash, we just learnt about the milestones, important steps that have been taken in international climate governance over the years. This loss and damage fund, for example, let's take it up. Finally, we have some concrete action on it at COP28. But then you have raised the question of who will pay. And I think this is still unsettled, isn't it? And if it's only voluntary contributions based on some formula, doesn't look like it's going to be sufficient.
By the standards of climate negotiations, having built a bucket, as it were, so fast, getting people to agree on the rules around that bucket with some serious compromises. In particular, there was a lot of question about whether the World Bank should be the implementer of this fund. And it's been agreed to under some conditions. That is an accomplishment. And I think it's worth pausing and recognizing that, because the weakest and most vulnerable have got something out of this process. And this is a process of high politics and interests. So that is worth celebrating. There's also creative ideas about things like aviation tariffs and shipping and financial transaction tax, these kinds of global structures being used to collect money for the loss and damage fund, which I think are interesting and worth pursuing. So there are not that many victories in this one, so let's just applaud this one. It counts as a victory. It counts as a victory. Should we go ahead to the very complex questions?
Equity and fairness. It's always the fundamental question, isn't it? And what do we need to push for these outcomes?
Absolutely. So equity and fairness operates. So it's for India and other developing countries. It is at the core of the UNFCCC process. There's a phrase that those of us who track climate negotiations use: common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. Right? Now, the Paris Agreement, which was talked about in that video, was in a sense the agreement there was based on a prior agreement by the US and China, which at the time had a tighter relationship. The G2, as they were beginning to be called then and still are now. And they added the phrase, in light of shifting national circumstances. Now, what that phrase did is basically cracked open the door to the categorization of developed and developing, what in the earlier part of the negotiations were called Annex 1, non-Annex 1. It cracked open the door to there being some movement between those categories, that countries might graduate, in particular, potentially China. And so it opened the door to the idea that, yes, there is an important difference between developed and developing, historical responsibility and less historical responsibility for the problem, but that context also matters. Even within developing countries, there are variations. And within the industrialized countries, to a lesser extent, there are some variations. And this is where it's important to draw a line between viewing this as a diplomat and viewing this as an analyst. If you're a diplomat, it is very advantageous to you to make sure that that line is drawn as crisply as possible, which is why people were quite upset that it became blurred in Paris. And I've heard, diplomats being very concerned about this. As an analyst, the question is, given the fact that we have different circumstances, China is different from India, India is different from Burundi, Burundi is different from Brazil, and so on. Do we need to have a more nuanced way of talking about this? But by having that nuanced way of talking about it, do we give up on the very important principle of equity? As an analyst, that is the question one asks. As a diplomat, one doesn't want to go very close to that question. So I just want to sort of put that out there as a way of thinking about this. Sure. Now, the key really is, as you said, how on earth are we going to start reducing emissions? I am firmly of the view that emissions will reduce not because there's global pressure on India or anybody else. Nobody is going to go against their interests. For example, African countries that are fossil fuel providers, gas emitters, a huge part of their economy is actually dependent on gas, right? Why would they turn off that tap unless there's an option? Somewhat ironically and hypocritically, in the wake of the Ukraine-Russia crisis, European nations worried about their own energy security, despite starting from a high level of energy use, have been also beating a path to Africa to sign gas contracts.
Right.
Now we're going to hear a lot about fossil fuel phase down in this Dubai COP, but every country is going to do this for their own interests. So to me, the key question is how do country after country redefine their interests in a way in which they can develop, but do so in a clean way.
Yeah, and probably that redefinition will happen only when there are more catastrophes, unfortunately. I mean, it will have to get a lot worse before it gets better, because people only respond and react when they are facing, real physical calamities right in front of their eyes, and those are also increasing. But viewers, India is making a mark, always been a very responsible player in the climate negotiations. Let's listen to Prime Minister Modi at the COP28 in Dubai and continue the discussion.
साथियों, पिछली शताब्दी की गलतियों को सुधारने के लिए हमारे पास बहुत ज्यादा समय नहीं है। मानव जाति के एक छोटे हिस्से ने प्रकृति का अंधाधुंध दोहन किया, लेकिन इसकी कीमत पूरी मानवता को चुकानी पड़ रही है, विशेषकर ग्लोबल साउथ के निवासियों को। सिर्फ मेरा भला हो, ये सोच दुनिया को एक अंधेरे की तरफ ले जाएगी। इस हॉल में बैठा प्रत्येक व्यक्ति, प्रत्येक राष्ट्राध्यक्ष बहुत बड़ी जिम्मेदारी के साथ यहां आया है। हम में से सभी को अपने दायित्व निभाने ही होंगे। पूरी दुनिया आज हमें देख रही है, इस धरती का भविष्य हमें देख रहा है, हमें सफल होना ही होगा। वी हैव टू बी डिसिसिव। हमें संकल्प लेना होगा कि हर देश अपने लिए जो क्लाइमेट टारगेट तय कर रहा है, जो कमिटमेंट कर रहा है, वो पूरा कर कर ही दिखाएगा। वी हैव टू वर्क इन यूनिटी। हमें संकल्प लेना होगा कि हम मिलकर काम करेंगे, एक दूसरे का सहयोग करेंगे, साथ देंगे। हमें ग्लोबल कार्बन बजट में सभी विकासशील देशों को उचित शेयर देना होगा। वी हैव टू बी मोर बैलेंस। हमें यह संकल्प लेना होगा कि एडॉप्शन, मिटिगेशन, क्लाइमेट फाइनेंस, टेक्नोलॉजी, लॉस एंड डैमेज, इन सब पर संतुलन बनाते हुए आगे बढ़ें। वी हैव टू बी एम्बिशियस। हमें संकल्प लेना होगा कि एनर्जी ट्रांजिशन जस्ट हो, इंक्लूसिव हो, इक्विटेबल हो। वी हैव टू बी इनोवेटिव। हमें यह संकल्प लेना होगा कि इनोवेटिव टेक्नोलॉजी का लगातार विकास करें, अपने स्वार्थ से ऊपर उठकर दूसरे देशों को टेक्नोलॉजी ट्रांसफर करें।
Right. So viewers, Prime Minister emphasizing the need for equity and fairness, which is also our theme in this show. Dr. Dubash, India, you have also written about this, initially was seen as a naysayer and someone which obstructs the consensus on multilateral negotiations. But now we have come up with a lot of new initiatives. So the Biofuels Alliance, for example, our leadership in the G20, we have pushed for a Green Development Pact. And we have the International Solar Alliance, the Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure, and now we are talking about lead IT, leading industry towards the transition, and also green credits. So there are a lot of new things that we have come up with, new ideas, and that way India seems to be much more open and creative in its multilateral climate diplomacy than before, isn't it? This seems like a big change.
Yes, I think there has been a lot of change, and it stems from something you said just before we heard the Prime Minister's remarks, which is, for countries to perhaps shift their understanding of interest may take many more catastrophes. Respectfully, I'm not sure that that's entirely the case. We have seen some incredible catastrophes. We've seen flooding in Pakistan last year. We've seen heat waves across the world. We've seen Canadian wildfires. My own feeling is, even in the face of these catastrophes, countries say, yes, it's terribly problematic. Somebody else should do something about it. And in particular, when we didn't cause the problem, why should we risk potential economic shortfalls or energy security or anything else? And every country has some story like that. So I come back to this point that countries would change their position when they see their interests changing. They won't act against their interests. And this brings me back to, I think, where India's sort of recent slew of diplomatic initiatives that have been very creative. I think partly it's happened for two reasons. We have been very creative about seizing the narrative, saying we are a vulnerable country, we do care about climate change, and we're doing all these things, including the Coalition on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure and so on. But what has also changed, I think, is our own understanding of our interests. We know that we're not foregoing fossil fuel use. 70%, 80% of our electricity still comes from coal. But I think there's a growing realization that there is scope for India to have competitive advantage by being an early mover in technologies like battery, technologies like hydrogen. We see the solar potential in India. And so we are doing what a responsible power should do, which is something that promotes the global good while also promoting the national good. And I have in the past talked about this idea of co-benefits, where these things come together. We have to be creative about maximizing co-benefits while not being too over-optimistic. There are sometimes trade-offs. Sometimes we may need to, for example, how fast we can phase down fossil fuel is an open question among analysts. That is something we have to be perhaps cautious about, while realizing that the faster we do it, the greater our competitive advantage will be, because the more of a leader we'll be in the technologies of the future. And this is where sometimes, so let me just pause there. So I think that shift in interest has then very cleverly been dovetailed with a strategic narrative that says, here's how we see our interests being reflected by all these initiatives that do both serve the national interest and the global interest.
Right. Dr. Dubash, last point about non-state actors, private corporations, these obviously need to be brought in, both in terms of contributing to these climate funds and damage funds and all these things, but also in terms of the emissions mitigation. It's not just the role of governments, right? That's why we are doing this LEAD IT. This is one of the new initiatives where we want to bring in private sector as stakeholders for energy transition to prod and nudge them in that direction. How much should the intergovernmental framework focus on private actors, and do you think what kind of incentives and pressures we must apply for them to play a ball? Because without that, without industry especially, I think we are going nowhere.
I think that's right. But let me use that question to make a broader point. You mentioned finance earlier, which we never came back to. And I think in terms of the non-governmental actors, it is both finance and industry. So part of this is going to be public finance to leverage change. But the scales we're talking about, which is now in the trillions. So, for example, the N.K. Singh, Larry Summers report, which the G20 Delhi declaration invokes, talked about $2.4 trillion by 2030, just for climate, and then more for sustainable development, as you mentioned. So there is an important challenge here. This is a capital-intensive transition. And that's true for the industrial transition you talked about also. All of these technologies to get carbon out of industrial manufacturing are enormously capital intensive. So that capital has to be mobilized and industry has to be brought in. So we have to understand what the needs of industry are, but we don't want to get into a game where industry is not taking its own risks. You don't want to privatize profit and socialize risk. At the same time, you understand industry can't do it by itself. So it's walking a very careful line where government has to lead, but in partnership by understanding the needs of industry. And not only industry, also civil society. So for example, there are municipal groups, there are civil society groups in cities, There are groups at local levels, particularly talking about adaptation. They have wisdom about how natural resources are used. So we need, that takes me to my final point, I think, which is worth making, that for India as well as other countries, we need to build a climate governance framework that is flexible, that deepens the capacity of the state, but where the government doesn't hold on to all the decisions. We enable others to get into the conversation because they are the ones who ultimately have to implement, whether it's at the local level in agriculture, forest, coast, or at the level of industry and finance in the banking sector. Right. So this requires a transformation of economies and societies. It's what I like to call a whole of economy, whole of society problem, and others use that phrase as well. That is a very complex governance challenge. How do you bring that about?
How do we bring that about, Dr. Dubash? I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are out of time. But the question is, we need a nuanced approach, as Dr. Navroz Dubash says, and we need collective action, but we also need to focus on national interests and to redefine national interests. And India has done it. India is offering leadership and also thinking about its own domestic challenges with worsening climate conditions. And we hope that other countries will follow India's lead and implement their nationally determined contributions and do better, because ambition is necessary, as the United Nations and others are saying, and without that we will be in a very sorry condition in decades to come. The global warming targets, we are way behind it and struggling, but then Dr. Dubash, we hope that some of your insights will also get across, because ultimately it requires many stakeholders and the role of intellectuals is very important. I appreciate your presence in our show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. I enjoyed the conversation with you.
Climate change is upon us and we are all suffering from the adverse consequences. India is making best possible efforts to achieve multilateral consensus and to also initiate new ideas and principles that will take the climate negotiations and discussions forward, and most importantly, climate action forward. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.